Master Sergeant Raphael Duart was 71 years old when he finally returned to Corvin's Rest, and he had spent every one of the intervening 30 years believing he would never see this world again. He had been 22, then, a junior peacekeeping soldier assigned to a joint human garrison stationed on the contested world under a fragile treaty brokered between the fledgling human diplomatic corps and the vast, ancient Threnic Imperium. The garrison had numbered 311 soldiers, human volunteers assigned to enforce a demilitarized zone between two warring Threnic factions, under explicit guarantee, signed and sealed by the Imperium's own Grand Steward, that Imperial forces would provide full military support should either faction violate the treaty's terms. That guarantee had lasted less than 4 months. When the larger of the two Threnic factions finally broke the ceasefire, launching a coordinated assault against the demilitarized zone the human garrison had been posted to protect, the Imperium's promised support never materialized. Raphael had never learned, in the 30 years since, the full political calculus behind that decision, whether it had been simple cowardice, a calculated abandonment of an inconvenient treaty obligation, or something considerably more cynical, a decision made by distant imperial officials who had judged 311 human lives an acceptable cost for avoiding a wider, more costly conflict. He knew only that the garrison had held its position for 6 days, expecting reinforcement that never came, before the position was finally overrun. Raphael had been one of 11 survivors evacuated in the engagement's final desperate hours. 300 soldiers had not been so fortunate. He stood now on the same rocky plateau, 30 years later, looking at the weathered memorial marker Earth's diplomatic corps had erected in the years following the garrison's destruction. A simple, unadorned stone bearing 300 names, standing quiet vigil over ground that had in the decades since become something considerably more complicated than a simple battlefield memorial. It had become, in the careful, patient language of human diplomatic doctrine, a debt still owed. "You didn't have to come back for this, Sergeant," said Colonel Adiz Bello, standing beside him in the crisp formal uniform of Earth's modern expeditionary fleet, her voice carrying the particular gentle respect she'd shown him since their first meeting weeks earlier, when she'd personally traveled to his retirement community to extend the invitation. "I know how much this world has cost you." "I know I didn't have to," Raphael said quietly, his weathered hand resting against the cold stone of the memorial, tracing, without quite meaning to, the engraved name of a young corporal he'd once shared a bunk with, who had died covering the garrison's final retreat. "I wanted to, 30 years, Colonel. I never thought I'd live to see anyone actually collect on what this world owes." He thought back, standing there, to the young man he'd been barely out of officer training, terrified in a way he'd never fully admitted to anyone in the years since, watching soldiers he'd known for less than a year die around him in a war he'd been sent to prevent, not fight. He remembered the particular, brutal clarity of the garrison's 6th day, ammunition nearly spent, reinforcement radio silence stretching hour after hour into a silence that had, by the engagement's final hours, stopped feeling like delay and started feeling like abandonment. He remembered, most of all, the strange, quiet calm that had settled over the 11 of them who survived, in the final minutes before their evacuation transport arrived, not relief, not yet, but something closer to a shared, unspoken decision about what they owed the 300 who wouldn't be leaving with them. He remembered, too, the specific voice of Captain Myril Akafa, the garrison's commanding officer, who had not survived to be evacuated herself, speaking to the 11 of them in the last radio transmission she managed before the final push overran her position. She had not asked them to avenge her or the rest of the garrison. She had asked them simply to remember accurately, not to let grief or fear reshape what had actually happened into something simpler, or something that made hatred easier to justify than the harder work of holding an old promise honestly. Raphael had carried her words for 30 years, alongside the names on the stone, and he understood now, standing before the memorial as an old man rather than a frightened young soldier, that everything the delegation had come to accomplish traced back, in some quiet way, to that final transmission. Grand Steward Ilan Kavash had inherited many things upon assuming his office within the Threnic Imperium's sprawling administrative hierarchy 3 years earlier. Vast estates, ancient ceremonial titles, the accumulated political obligations of a dynasty that had governed portions of the Imperium for over 4 centuries. He had not expected, among that inheritance, to also receive a debt his predecessor had incurred 30 years earlier, one that the Imperium's own careful historical record had, until recently, treated as a quietly settled matter. The humans have requested a formal diplomatic audience, his chief advisor informed him some weeks before the human fleet's arrival, delivering the news with visible unease. Regarding Corvain's rest, Ilan had needed a moment to place the reference, before the full weight of his own Imperial Archive's careful, euphemistic language finally registered. Corvain's rest, the world where, 30 years earlier, his predecessor Grand Steward Kessel Van had made the calculated, cynical decision to withhold promised military support from a human peacekeeping garrison, judging the diplomatic and military cost of intervention too high to justify honoring the Imperium's signed treaty obligations. They wish to discuss reparations, I assume, Ilan said, with the weary resignation of an official accustomed to inheriting his predecessor's unresolved obligations. They have not specified their intent, Grand Steward, his advisor said. Only that a fleet will arrive within the month, and that they wish to discuss, in their formal request, precisely what I am quoting their diplomatic transmission directly, a debt 30 years overdue is actually worth. Ilan considered this for a long moment, reviewing what little his archives contained on the original incident, a brief, carefully worded internal report from 30 years earlier, noting the garrison's destruction with the same flat, bureaucratic language the Imperium typically reserved for minor administrative setbacks, rather than the deaths of 300 allied soldiers his predecessor's government had explicitly promised to protect. Prepare a formal reception, he said finally, and find me historian Amma. If anyone within this Imperium understands what humanity might actually intend by that phrase, it will be him. Historian Ves Amma had spent the better part of 2 decades studying humanity's response to the Corvain's Rest betrayal, a scholarly preoccupation that had, over the years, earned him a reputation within imperial academic circles as something between a respected authority and a mildly eccentric curiosity. I confess, Grand Steward, he told Ilan, during the formal briefing arranged in advance of the human fleet's arrival, that I have never fully resolved the central question that first drew me to this study. Humanity possessed, within 5 years of the Corvain's Rest betrayal, sufficient military capability to mount a credible retaliatory strike against imperial territory. Their diplomatic corps issued no formal protest beyond an initial, carefully worded expression of grief and disappointment. Their military doctrine, in every subsequent engagement involving Threnic forces, has shown no discernible pattern of retaliatory aggression tied to the original incident. And yet, he paused, choosing his next words with evident care. And yet every human diplomatic archive I have been permitted to access references Corvain's Rest with a consistency and a gravity that suggests this species has never once forgotten what occurred there, despite 30 years of otherwise cordial, even productive, diplomatic relations with this Imperium. You are telling me, Ilan said slowly, that they have neither forgiven this debt nor sought to collect it through force for 30 years. That is my assessment, Grand Steward, yes, Ves said. I do not believe humanity operates from the same framework regarding old grievances that Threnic political culture typically assumes. We are accustomed to debts of this nature eventually resolving in one of 2 directions, either formal reparation, negotiated and concluded within a reasonable interval, or eventual retaliation should reparation never be offered. Humanity appears to have selected neither path for 30 full years. I do not know what that means about what they now intend to ask of us. I know only that whatever it is, I do not believe it will resemble either of the outcomes our own history would typically predict. Ilan found himself, in the days that followed, returning repeatedly to that assessment, turning it over the way he might a diplomatic riddle he could not quite solve. He had governed, in his 3 years as Grand Steward, through a political culture that understood consequence primarily through two familiar lenses: the swift, decisive punishment of a grievance answered quickly, or the slow, grinding resentment of one left permanently unaddressed, poisoning relations for generations until some crisis finally forced a reckoning. He found the notion of a grievance held, deliberately and completely, for 30 patient years, without ever curdling into either of those familiar shapes, genuinely difficult to imagine, and more than a little unsettling in a manner he could not entirely articulate even to himself. Colonel Adiz Bello's fleet arrived above Corvin's Rest 3 weeks later, a modest formation by any reasonable military standard, considerably smaller than the overwhelming force the Threnic Imperium's own defensive doctrine might have anticipated from a civilization arriving to settle a 30-year-old grievance through military means. Confirm fleet composition, Grand Steward Ilan Kavash requested, reviewing the censor reports with visible, uncertain apprehension. 11 vessels, Grand Steward, came the response, predominantly diplomatic and transport configuration. Combat capability present but modest, consistent with an escort formation, not an invasion force. Ilan absorbed this with a measure of cautious relief, though Ves Amma, standing beside him reviewing the same reports, offered a more measured assessment. I would not mistake modest military presence for an absence of resolve, Grand Steward, the historian said quietly. I do not believe this fleet's composition tells us they have come for anything less serious than what their diplomatic transmission suggested. I believe it tells us, instead, precisely how they intend to pursue it. Aboard the Meridian's Promise, Colonel Bello's flagship, Raphael Duart stood at the observation deck's forward viewport during the fleet's final approach, watching Corvin's Rest grow slowly larger against the dark, its familiar rust-colored terrain unmistakable even after 30 years' absence. You've been quiet since we crossed into the system, Adiz said, joining him at the viewport. Trying to figure out what I'm supposed to feel, Raphael admitted. I thought I'd have it worked out by now, Colonel. 30 years is a long time to prepare for a moment. I still don't quite know what to do with it, now that it's actually here. You don't have to know, Adiz said. Nobody's expecting you to have a tidy answer for this. I'm not sure I have one myself, and I only carried this promise second-hand, through my mother's stories, not through 6 days of actually living it. Raphael was quiet for a long moment, watching the planet's slow rotation carry the old plateau gradually into view. I think, he said finally, what I feel is something like relief, mixed up with a grief I never fully finished having, both at once. I didn't expect that combination, if I'm honest. I thought it'd feel more like closing a door. It feels more like finally being able to open one I've kept shut for 30 years. Maybe that's what keeping a promise this old actually feels like, Adiz said quietly, not an ending. Just finally letting yourself feel everything you couldn't afford to feel back when you first made it. Raphael nodded slowly, and the two of them stood together in silence for the remainder of the approach, watching the world that had taken so much from him grow steadily closer beneath them. The formal reception, held in the Imperium's Grand Ceremonial Hall 3 days after the human fleet's arrival, brought together Grand Steward Ilan Kavash's full diplomatic delegation and a modest human contingent led by Colonel Bello and Ambassador Yuki Tanaka Reyes, with Master Sergeant Raphael Duart, at his own quiet insistence, standing present as well, the only member of the delegation who had actually served on Corvin's Rest during the original betrayal. Grand Steward Kavash, Ambassador Tanaka Reyes began, her voice carrying the careful, measured formality of decades of diplomatic training. I want to be direct about the nature of our visit, because I believe directness has been owed to your Imperium for considerably longer than either of us has held our current offices. 30 years ago, this Imperium signed a treaty guaranteeing military support to a human peacekeeping garrison stationed on Corvin's Rest. When that garrison came under attack, exactly as the treaty anticipated it might, no support arrived. 300 human soldiers died as a direct consequence of that broken promise. I am aware of the historical record, Ambassador, Ilan said carefully, and I want to state clearly, before this proceeds further, that I did not hold this office at the time of that decision, and that I do not believe my predecessor's choice reflects the values this Imperium currently holds regarding its treaty obligations. I believe that, Grand Steward, Tanaka Reyes said, I am not here to hold you personally responsible for a decision made before you assumed office. But I am here because a promise was broken, and because humanity has spent 30 years remembering exactly what that promise cost us, and I believe it is finally time to discuss what settling that debt should actually mean. Ilan braced himself, expecting, despite historian Ammer's careful earlier assessment, some manner of retaliatory demand, territorial concession, punitive reparation, some formal acknowledgement of imperial guilt calculated to extract maximum diplomatic humiliation. What is it, he asked carefully, that humanity believes this debt requires? Ambassador Tanaka Reyes glanced briefly at Master Sergeant Raphael Duarte, standing quietly at the delegation's edge, before answering. When the 11 survivors of the Corvin's Rest garrison were evacuated, she said, they carried with them a promise, made collectively, over what they believed at the time would be their own graves as much as their fallen comrades. I would like Sergeant Duarte to share that promise directly, if he is willing. I believe it matters more, coming from him, than it would from any formal diplomatic transcript. Raphael stepped forward, and Ilan watched, with a measure of genuine surprise, as the elderly soldier's weathered composure carried, even now, 30 years removed from the engagement itself, the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once held a line he'd believed, at the time, he would not survive. We were surrounded on the 6th day, Raphael said, his voice steady despite its age. Down to 11 of us still capable of fighting, out of 311 who'd started. We didn't know in that moment whether any of us would make it off that plateau alive. Somebody, I don't remember who first said it, we were all pretty far past keeping careful track by that point. Somebody said we ought to make a promise, in case we didn't make it, not a promise of revenge. We talked about that actually in those final hours. Some of us wanted it. I understood why, and I won't pretend I didn't feel some of that pull myself. But in the end, what we agreed to promise each other was something different. We promised that if any of us survived, and if humanity ever had the standing to actually hold this Imperium accountable for what happened here, we wouldn't let that accountability turn into simple vengeance. We'd make sure it meant something better than that. Something that actually made this world, and worlds like it, safer for whoever came after us, human or otherwise. The ceremonial hall was silent for a long moment, Ilan absorbing the weight of what he was hearing, with a growing, complicated understanding that ran considerably deeper than the simple diplomatic anxiety he'd carried into the reception. You are telling me, he said slowly, that this fleet has arrived, after 30 years, not to extract retaliation for a broken promise, but to fulfill one your own soldiers made instead. That is precisely what I am telling you, Grand Steward, Raphael said. We buried 300 soldiers on this plateau 30 years ago. Every single year since, on the anniversary of that final day, surviving members of this garrison have gathered, fewer of us each year, I'm sorry to say, to renew that promise to each other. I'm the last one left who was actually there. I did not know, until Colonel Bello came to find me a few months back, whether humanity would ever actually have the diplomatic and military standing to make good on it. I am grateful, more than I have words to properly express, that we finally do. Colonel Adiz, Bello stepped forward to formally present the delegation's specific proposal, her own voice carrying a personal weight that Ilan did not yet fully understand, though he would, before the reception concluded. Grand Steward, she said, humanity is requesting 3 specific commitments from this Imperium, in exchange for considering the Corvin's Rest debt formally, and finally settled. First, a joint human-threnic peacekeeping accord, permanently establishing shared military obligation across every future demilitarized zone either civilization commits forces to, with binding, verifiable enforcement mechanisms considerably stronger than the treaty this imperium broke 30 years ago. Second, formal imperial funding, in perpetuity, for a joint memorial and historical education program on Corvin's Rest, ensuring that what happened here is taught honestly, on both sides, to every future generation who might otherwise be tempted to treat a signed treaty as merely a convenient formality. And third, she paused, and Ilan watched something in her composed, professional bearing shift into something considerably more personal. Third, she continued, a formal imperial acknowledgement, delivered publicly and without diplomatic hedging, that the soldiers who died on this plateau were not an acceptable cost of avoiding a wider conflict, but allies this imperium failed through cowardice and calculation, and that this imperium bears full responsibility for that failure, regardless of how many years have passed, or how many officials have since inherited the consequences of a decision they did not personally make. Ilan was quiet for a long moment, understanding, finally, the full shape of what humanity had traveled 30 years and considerable distance to request, not vengeance, not the punitive reparations his own political instincts had braced to negotiate against, but something that struck him. The longer he considered it, as considerably more difficult to simply grant and be done with. An honest reckoning, permanently codified, and a structural commitment that would bind his imperium's future conduct rather than merely punishing its past failure. "May I ask," he said finally, "why this delegation includes you personally, Colonel Bello? I do not believe I have yet heard the full context of your own connection to this mission." Adiz was quiet for a moment, glancing briefly at Raphael Duart before answering. "My mother was one of the 11 survivors evacuated from this plateau, Grand Steward," she said. "She died 6 years ago, but she spent every year of my childhood telling me about the promise she and her fellow survivors made to each other in what they believed were their final hours. I joined Earth's expeditionary fleet in part because I wanted to be standing here, someday, if the day ever came that humanity finally had the standing to make good on what she'd promised. I did not expect, when I joined, that it would actually happen within my own career. I am grateful it has." The negotiations that followed extended across nearly 3 weeks, considerably longer than the ceremonial reception's opening exchange had suggested they might, as imperial legal scholars and human diplomatic staff worked through the precise, binding language of an accord considerably more structurally significant than either delegation had initially anticipated when the human fleet first arrived. There were sharp disagreements along the way, Imperial Legal Council pushing back hard against the enforcement mechanisms Ambassador Tanaka Reyes insisted upon, arguing that binding, verifiable obligation of that severity was unprecedented in Threnic treaty history and risked establishing a dangerous political precedent for future negotiations with other allied species. Tanaka Reyes held her ground through each objection with the same patient, unhurried persistence Colonel Bello had watched her deploy across weeks of careful, incremental progress. "That is precisely the point, Counselor," she told the Imperium's chief legal advisor during one particularly tense session in the Accord's second week. "Your Imperium's history has, until now, treated treaty obligations as negotiable once the political cost of honoring them becomes inconvenient. We are not asking you to establish an unprecedented burden. We are asking you to finally close a loophole that cost 300 lives the last time it was left open." The advisor had, in the end, conceded the point, though it took 11 further days of careful drafting to translate that concession into binding legal language both delegations could formally endorse. During those same weeks, Colonel Bello arranged for a small gathering of Corvin's Rest descendants, children and grandchildren of the garrison's fallen, several of whom had traveled with the fleet at their own request, having grown up, as Adiz had, on stories of a debt they'd never expected to see settled in their own lifetimes. She found them one evening, assembled quietly near the memorial, sharing photographs and old letters their parents and grandparents had carried home from the engagement's aftermath. "My grandfather never talked about it," said one young lieutenant, a great-grandson of a soldier who had died on the plateau's 6th day, holding a faded photograph carefully in both hands. "Not directly. My grandmother told me once that he used to come out here in his mind sometimes, even decades later, sitting quietly at the dinner table like he wasn't really in the room anymore. I always wondered what that must have felt like, carrying something that heavy for that long, never quite able to put it down." "I think that's exactly what this whole delegation has been about," Adiz said quietly, "finally letting people put it down, not by forgetting it, by finishing it." The young lieutenant nodded slowly, looking out at the weathered stone bearing his great-grandfather's name among 300 others. "I hope he'd be glad we came," he said. "I think he would," Adiz said. "I think all 300 of them would." Historian Ves Ammer found himself, over the course of those same weeks, drawn increasingly into direct conversation with Master Sergeant Raphael Duarte, the two of them developing an unlikely rapport built on the historian's genuine scholarly curiosity and the old soldier's patient willingness to finally, after 30 years, speak openly about what he had carried. "I have spent 2 decades studying your species' response to this betrayal," Ves admitted during one such conversation, the two of them walking slowly across the memorial plateau in the cool evening light. "I confess, I did not anticipate the actual answer would prove this straightforward, once finally spoken aloud. A promise kept for 30 years, delivered not through force, but through patient diplomatic persistence. It wasn't straightforward to live through, historian," Raphael said. 30 years is a long time to carry a promise like that, not knowing if you'll live long enough to see it kept. I buried most of the people who made that promise alongside me before this fleet ever arrived. I'm the last one standing who actually remembers making it." "Does that weigh on you?" Ves asked, "being the last?" Raphael considered the question for a long moment, looking out at the weathered stone memorial. At the 300 names his own memory could still, even now, mostly recite in order. "Every day," he admitted. "But I think it would have weighed on me worse, historian, if I'd lived to see this promise broken instead of kept. I've got that much, at least. Whatever else this old body's got left in it, I got to stand here and watch us finally keep our word. May I ask you something, Sergeant, that I have wondered for the entirety of my scholarly career?" Ves said. "In those final hours, when your garrison first made this promise, did any of you seriously consider the alternative, the retaliation your species clearly possessed the eventual capability to pursue?" Raphael was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful honesty he'd brought to every conversation across the preceding weeks. "Some of us did," he admitted. "I won't lie to you about that, historian. There were a few hours in there where vengeance felt like the only thing that would ever make what happened mean anything at all. I understood that pull. I still understand it, if I'm honest, 30 years on." He paused. "But we talked it through in what time we had, and what we kept coming back to was this: if we spent the rest of our lives, however long that turned out to be, chasing payback for what happened here, we'd just be adding more graves to a debt that already had too many. We wanted something different, something that actually made the deaths mean more than just an excuse for more of them." Ves considered this for a long moment, looking out at the memorial stone, its 300 names catching the last of the evening light. "I do not believe my own culture would have made the same choice, Sergeant, if our positions had been reversed," he admitted quietly. "I have studied enough Threnic history to say that with some confidence. We are, as a civilization, considerably more comfortable with the language of retribution than the language you have just described to me. I confess, I do not fully know what to do with the discovery that another species found a third path we have rarely, if ever, seriously considered." "It wasn't easy to find, historian," Raphael said. "I want to be honest about that too. It would have been simpler, in a lot of ways, to just let the anger run its course. Simpler doesn't always mean better, though. We decided that, in the end, the harder path was the one actually worth walking, even if it took 30 years to get where we were going." The evening before the formal signing, Grand Steward Ilan Kavash walked the memorial plateau alone, a departure from his usual carefully managed schedule that his advisors had, with some concern, tried gently to discourage. He stood for a long while before the weathered stone, reading the 300 names in the fading light, understanding, more completely than any historical briefing had managed to convey, the true weight of what his predecessors' calculated cowardice had actually cost. He thought of his own children, safely asleep at home in the imperial capital, and tried, without much success, to imagine the particular horror of watching help simply never arrive, hour after hour, until there was no help left to hope for. He thought, too, of Raphael Duarte's quiet, patient account of that final promise, not vengeance, but justice, not retribution, but a debt kept honestly, however long it took. He found himself, standing alone before the memorial in the gathering dark, genuinely moved by a species he had, until 6 weeks earlier, understood only through the cautious, careful language of diplomatic briefings. "I am sorry," he said quietly, to the stone and the names it carried, though no one else was present to hear it. "I did not make this happen. But I am the one standing here now, and I intend to make certain it never happens again." He returned to his quarters that night with a clarity he had not carried into the negotiations 6 weeks earlier, and signed the accord the following morning without a single further objection to its terms. The formal accord was signed 6 weeks after the human fleet's arrival, in a ceremony held, at Raphael Duarte's own quiet request, directly before the Corvin's Rest Memorial rather than within the Imperium's Grand Ceremonial Hall. A decision Grand Steward Ilan Kavash had, somewhat to his own surprise, readily agreed to, understanding, by that point in the negotiations, precisely why the location mattered. "I want to say something," Ilan said, once the formal signatures had been completed, addressing the assembled delegation with a genuine, unrehearsed gravity that departed considerably from his earlier ceremonial formality. "I did not hold this office 30 years ago. I did not make the decision that led to this memorial's 300 names. But I hold this office now, and I accept, fully and without reservation, this Imperium's responsibility for what occurred here, not because humanity has forced that acceptance through threat or retaliation, but because you have shown me, over these 6 weeks, exactly what kind of accountability you actually believe in. I do not think my predecessor's generation would have understood a debt like this one. I believe I am beginning to." Raphael Duarte stood before the memorial afterward, once the formal ceremony had concluded and the assembled delegations had begun, gradually, to disperse, his weathered hand once again resting against the cold stone, tracing the engraved names of soldiers he had carried in memory for 30 long years. "We kept it," he said quietly, to no one in particular, though Colonel Bello, standing nearby, heard him clearly enough. 30 years, and we finally kept it." "We did," Adiz said, coming to stand beside him. "My mother would be proud, Sergeant. I hope you know that." "I know it," Raphael said. "I think I've known it since the moment you first came to find me. Some debts, Colonel, take considerably longer to collect than anyone expects when they're first made. Doesn't mean they were ever forgotten in the meantime, just means it took time to do it properly instead of quickly." Colonel Adiz, Bello's formal report on the Corvin's Rest Accord, filed some weeks after the fleet's return to Earth, would become, in the years that followed, a foundational text studied across every diplomatic and military academy, preparing officers for future joint peacekeeping operations, cited not for any singular tactical or diplomatic maneuver, but for a single observation near its conclusion that Adiz had spent considerable time carefully composing. "My mother taught me, from childhood, that a promise made over the graves of the fallen carries a weight that outlasts the immediate grief of the moment it was made," she wrote. "I did not fully understand what she meant until I stood on that plateau myself, 30 years after her garrison's destruction, watching the last survivor of that betrayal finally see it answered, not through the vengeance some of them considered in their final desperate hours, but through the patient, considerably more difficult promise they ultimately chose instead. I believe this is perhaps the truest measure of what this species is capable of when we are wronged. Not that we forget, and not that we simply forgive, but that we remember completely for as long as it takes, and choose deliberately what that memory is ultimately allowed to become. We chose justice on Corvin's Rest over retribution. I do not believe that choice was easy for the soldiers who first made it in their final hours, or simple for the 30 years of quiet, patient diplomacy that followed. I believe it was, simply, the choice that made the promise worth keeping. Master Sergeant Raphael Duart returned to Earth some weeks later, carrying with him a small fragment of stone taken, with careful permission, from the memorial's edge, a quiet, private keepsake he kept for the remainder of his life, a reminder of a promise finally kept, 30 years and one long, patient journey after it was first made, over the graves of soldiers who had trusted their fellow survivors to carry it forward, however long it ultimately took. He lived another 6 years after the Accord's signing, long enough to see the first cohort of joint human-threnic peacekeeping cadets graduate under the Accord's new enforcement framework, long enough to attend, once more, the annual gathering on Corvin's Rest, no longer the last survivor speaking alone before an empty plateau, but one voice among a growing crowd of students, historians, and descendants who had come to learn what the stone names actually meant. On his final visit, standing once more before the memorial with historian Ammer beside him, he said the only thing he'd ever found adequate to the weight of it. 300 names, he said quietly, and every single one of them finally got to matter for something more than just what was taken from them. Ves Ammer, who had by then spent nearly 3 decades of his scholarly career trying to understand this single, patient promise, found, standing beside the old soldier in the fading light, that he no longer needed to understand it as an academic puzzle at all. He understood it simply as a debt kept, the rarest and most difficult kind there was.